In the middle of a blinding snowstorm, a small-town waitress opened her doors to a freezing old woman. She thought she was saving a stranger's life, but by morning the stranger's son, a powerful millionaire, would appear at her door, and with him a truth that would turn her quiet life upside down. If you believe that kindness can still change the world, this story will touch your heart. Stay till the end. You won't forget what happens when one act of compassion melts the coldest heart. Hit subscribe, like, and share this story to remind someone that empathy is never wasted. The snowstorm had swallowed the little town of Maplewood whole. Streets vanished beneath white drifts, and shop windows glowed dimly through the swirling frost. Inside the Maplewood diner, the soft hum of an old heater struggled against the cold seeping through the glass. Grace Porter wiped the counter for the third time that evening, her movements steady and deliberate. The diner had been her safe haven ever since life had taken everything familiar from her. She knew every squeak of the floor, every flicker of the neon sign outside, and tonight, that familiarity was all she had to fight the loneliness that came with the storm. The last customer had left an hour ago, urging her to close early before the roads froze solid, but Grace couldn't. Something in her heart refused to shut the doors while the world outside felt so unforgiving. Maybe it was instinct, maybe compassion. Whatever it was, she listened to it. She poured herself another cup of coffee and stared out the window, watching the snow whip against the streetlight like a curtain of glass shards. The wind howled through the cracks in the door, almost like a warning. Then it happened. A sudden bang rattled the door, followed by a burst of icy air that snuffed out half the warmth in the room. Grace turned, startled, as a frail figure stumbled in. A woman hunched against the wind, her coat far too thin, her gray hair crusted with snowflakes. For a moment, she stood motionless, trembling from the cold. Then her knees gave out. Grace dropped her mug and rushed forward, catching the woman before she hit the floor. "Oh my goodness, ma'am, are you all right?" Grace's voice shook as she half-carried the stranger to the nearest booth. The woman's lips were pale, her hands blue at the fingertips. I got lost," she whispered, her breath thin and shallow. "My taxi driver, he dropped me off on the wrong street. I can't find my son's house." Grace didn't hesitate. She grabbed the thick wool blanket she kept behind the counter, wrapping it around the woman's shoulders, then hurried to make a cup of hot tea. "You're safe here," she said softly, setting the steaming mug down and rubbing the woman's hands to bring warmth back into them. The woman tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. "What's your name, dear?" Grace asked gently. "Eleanor," the woman murmured. "Eleanor Mitchell." "I'm Grace Porter." "You picked quite the night to get lost, Mrs. Mitchell," she said with a kind smile. Eleanor let out a weak laugh. "I thought I could surprise my son. I haven't seen him in years. But I suppose I surprised myself." Instead, Grace's eyes softened. She understood the weight in that voice, the regret, the longing, the quiet courage of someone who wanted to make things right. "Well," she said, "you're not alone tonight. This place may be small, but it's warm. You can rest here as long as you need." The old woman's eyes filled with gratitude as she held the cup close to her face, breathing in the steam like it was life itself. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the world into silence. Grace adjusted the blanket around Eleanor's shoulders and glanced toward the dark street beyond the window. The storm showed no signs of mercy, but inside the diner, something had shifted, a fragile warmth blooming between two strangers who, by fate or chance, had found each other in the heart of the blizzard. By dawn, the world outside the diner had turned to glass. Snow lay in sculpted waves across the street, untouched and glistening beneath a pale winter sun. Grace had dozed briefly in the corner booth, wrapped in her coat, waking at the faint hum of engines somewhere beyond the silence. The storm had passed, but its echo still clung to the windows. Eleanor slept soundly in the back office, her frail body finally at ease, her face softened in the calm that follows exhaustion. Grace smiled faintly, glad she had decided to keep the diner open. Then headlights cut through the frost. A large, dark SUV pulled up outside, its tires crunching through the snowdrift. Grace's stomach tightened. Few people ventured out this early, not unless they had reason. She moved toward the window, wiping a circle clear with her palm, and saw a tall man step out, dressed in an expensive black coat dusted with snow. His movements were sharp, efficient, as though even the cold wouldn't dare slow him. He paused, scanning the diner sign, then started toward the door with long, determined strides. When the bell above the door chimed, Grace felt the temperature in the room shift. Not colder, exactly, but charged, like static before a storm. The man's eyes were the color of a frozen lake, clear and unreadable. "I'm looking for Eleanor Mitchell," he said, his voice low but commanding. "She left a message saying she was here." Grace blinked. "She's resting," she replied carefully. "You must be her son." He gave a single curt nod. "Ethan Mitchell." So this was him. The son Eleanor had crossed a blizzard to find. He carried himself with a kind of polished restraint, every word clipped, every gesture deliberate. His presence filled the room as though he owned it. Grace straightened her shoulders and met his gaze evenly. "She's safe," she said. "You can see her once she wakes." "That's not acceptable," he said, already moving toward the back. Grace stepped in front of him, blocking his way. "It's not up for debate." Their eyes locked, the silence between them sharp as glass. Outside, wind rattled the windows again, a reminder of how fragile the world could be. Finally, Ethan exhaled, frustration flickering across his face. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll wait." Grace poured him a cup of coffee, sliding it across the counter. He hesitated, then took it. For a brief moment, the storm outside seemed to find its echo in the tension between them. Two strangers bound by an old woman's courage and a night the snow refused to forget. The hours stretched long inside the Maplewood diner, the world outside reduced to a blur of snow and silence. The storm, which had briefly eased, gathered strength again as dusk returned, an echo of the tension building within the walls. The heater groaned under the strain, and candlelight flickered against the chrome fixtures, painting the room in a soft, golden haze. Grace moved quietly between the counter and the back office, checking on Eleanor, who still slept soundly beneath layers of blankets. When she returned to the dining area, Ethan was seated at one of the booths, his phone pressed to his ear, his tone clipped and impatient. "Cancel the meeting," he said curtly. "The roads are blocked. I'll handle things when I return." He hung up, sliding the phone into his coat pocket. The controlled calm of his voice couldn't disguise the frustration beneath it. Grace could sense it in the way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers drummed restlessly on the table. "Coffee's still hot," she offered, breaking the silence. "Might help with the waiting." He looked up at her, his blue eyes sharp but weary. "You run this place alone?" "Most nights," she replied, refilling his cup. "The owner trusts me to keep things steady." "Not much else to do when you're snowed in anyway." He nodded, studying her as if trying to place her. "You don't strike me as someone meant for a small-town diner." Grace smiled faintly, not taking the bait. "And you don't strike me as someone who thanks people easily. Yet here you are, sitting in a booth instead of storming through my back door." His lips curved, just barely. "Touché." The lights flickered then, once, twice, before the entire diner plunged into darkness. Outside, thunder cracked through the storm, rolling across the hills. Grace sighed softly. Perfect timing. She found the flashlight beneath the counter and flicked it on, the narrow beam catching motes of dust in the air. "Generator should keep the heat on, but we'll need candles for light." "I'll help," Ethan said, already standing. Grace arched a brow. "The CEO knows how to light candles?" "I wasn't always a CEO," he replied dryly, rolling up his sleeves. "Besides, it's not that complicated." 15 minutes later, the diner glowed with warm pools of light. The storm raged outside, but within those flickering circles, there was a fragile sense of calm. Grace ladled soup into 2 bowls, setting one in front of Ethan. "Dinner's on the house," she said. He smiled faintly, lifting the spoon. "I'll try not to complain about the service." They ate in quiet companionship, the wind howling beyond the windows. After a while, he set the spoon down and leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "You remind me of someone," he said. "My mother used to tell me stories about people like you. Ordinary on the surface, extraordinary when it mattered." Grace looked down at her bowl. "I wouldn't call myself extraordinary." "I would," he said simply. Their eyes met across the flickering candlelight, and for a fleeting second, the storm outside seemed to fade. There was only the hum of the generator, the soft warmth of shared silence, and two people, each hiding from something, each recognizing a familiar loneliness in the other. The blizzard might have trapped them by chance, but something far deeper had begun to take root in that fragile night of tension and truth. Night deepened over Maplewood, wrapping the diner in a cocoon of snow and flickering candlelight. The storm outside had quieted to a whisper, but inside an invisible tension hummed, an electricity that neither Grace nor Ethan could quite name. Eleanor had woken briefly, her voice soft and confused, asking for her son. Ethan had gone to her side, his usual composure slipping into something gentler, something almost human. Grace watched quietly from the doorway, the light catching on his face as he tucked the blanket around his mother's shoulders. For a moment, the cold and distance that defined him melted away. When Eleanor drifted back to sleep, Ethan joined Grace near the counter, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his tone softer than before. "You could have called an ambulance and sent her to a shelter." Grace shrugged, wiping down the counter just to keep her hands busy. "Would have been easier, sure, but not right." He studied her profile in the low light. "You sound like someone who's been disappointed by people who did what was easier." She met his gaze, the corners of her mouth lifting faintly. "Haven't we all?" Before he could respond, a sound cut through the quiet, a firm knock against the diner door. Both of them turned toward the glass, startled. The storm had kept the roads nearly impassable. No one should have been out there. Grace hesitated, heart thudding, while Ethan moved forward with the caution of a man used to control. When he opened the door, a rush of cold air swept in, along with a man brushing snow off his tailored overcoat. "Ethan!" the newcomer exclaimed, his voice rich and confident. "I was starting to think you'd vanished off the map." Ethan's posture shifted instantly, stiffening with a mix of surprise and irritation. "James," he said flatly, "what are you doing here?" The man, tall, polished, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, extended a hand as if the weather were just a mild inconvenience. "The office said your mother was stranded in the storm. When I heard, I figured I'd find you before you froze too." Grace froze, the name sparking a memory she wished she'd buried. James Harrington. The sound of it alone made her blood run cold. He looked at her then, his expression faltering for the briefest moment, before he masked it with that same smooth charm. "Well," he said with a forced chuckle, "small world. Ms. Porter, isn't it?" The air shifted. Ethan glanced between them, sensing a current he couldn't quite define. "You know each other?" Grace's voice came out low, controlled. "We worked together." "A long time ago," James smiled tightly. "She was one of my brightest analysts. Shame she left so suddenly." Something dark flickered in Grace's eyes. Pain, anger, maybe both. But she said nothing. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Ethan's instincts sharpened. He'd built his career reading people, and what he saw in that moment told him more than words ever could. Whatever history these two shared, it wasn't pleasant. "Well," Grace said finally, her tone clipped, "if you're both here to wait out the storm, I'll make more coffee." She turned toward the counter before either man could speak, her movements calm but rigid, like someone preparing for impact. Behind her, Ethan's voice lowered to a near growl. "Why didn't you tell me you knew her?" James gave an easy laugh. "You didn't ask." But Grace didn't need to hear the rest to know what was coming. The past she had run from, the one she'd buried under years of quiet work and anonymity, had just walked through the door. And this time, there would be no escaping it. The diner felt smaller now, its warm glow dimming under the weight of the three people inside. The storm outside had dulled to a steady hush, but the tension brewing within those walls was far more dangerous. Grace could feel it in her pulse, the way Ethan's gaze had sharpened, the way James's presence felt like a shadow stretching across the room. She busied herself with the coffee pot, her back to them, pretending not to hear the low voices that began to murmur behind her. Ethan's tone carried the clipped edge of control. "Start explaining, James. You said you came because of my mother, but now I'm wondering if that's the truth." James laughed lightly, but it didn't sound natural. Come on, Ethan. Do you really think I'd risk driving through a blizzard for business? I was worried. Eleanor called the office, said you were missing. I just followed the trail. Grace set the mugs on the counter a bit too hard. The sharp clink made both men look up. She turned, forcing her face into neutrality. There's fresh coffee. Help yourselves. Still the same Grace Porter, James said smoothly, that old patronizing lilt curling around her name. Always pretending calm when you're boiling underneath. Grace's expression didn't flinch, but something in her eyes hardened. And you're still the same man who confuses charm for integrity. Ethan's head turned sharply toward her, then back to James. You two clearly have history. Start talking. James sighed as if exhausted by the drama. Fine. Miss Porter here once worked for my firm, Harrington Capital. A brilliant mind, honestly, but idealistic to a fault. She didn't understand that in business, sometimes compromises are necessary. Grace laughed, a sound without humor. You mean lies are necessary? Fraud? Manipulation? Whatever word makes it easier for you to sleep at night, Ethan's eyes narrowed. Fraud? James held up his hands, feigning innocence. She accused us of doctoring reports. It was nonsense, of course. The SEC investigated and found nothing. She panicked, tried to make herself a hero, and destroyed her own career in the process. That's not what happened, Grace said quietly. Her voice didn't need to rise. The conviction in it was enough to still the air. I found discrepancies, proof that Harrington Capital was inflating company valuations before mergers. I took it to James. The next morning, my access was revoked. By the end of the week, my name was on a list of terminated employees for ethical violations. The narrative was already written before I had a chance to speak. Ethan's expression darkened, confusion giving way to something heavier. And you never cleared your name? I tried, Grace said, her hands curling around the counter's edge. But James made sure I couldn't. Every firm I applied to suddenly lost interest. My reputation was ruined. I moved here to start over, to breathe again without the weight of their corruption following me. James chuckled, though the sound cracked at the edges. She's dramatizing, Ethan. The truth is simpler. She couldn't handle the pressure of real business. Ethan rose slowly from the booth. His height, his presence. It shifted the balance of the room. You expect me to believe that? Believe whatever you want, James snapped, dropping the mask for the first time. But remember what's at stake. We're days away from the Nortec acquisition, billions on the line, and you're going to risk it all because of a washed-up analyst with a vendetta? Grace turned, fury flashing through the composure she'd worked years to perfect. You mean the same Nortec whose financials look too clean to be real? The same company I flagged before I was fired? Ethan froze. What did you just say? James's voice rose, sharp now. She's bluffing. But Grace stepped forward, her eyes steady. No, I'm not. I kept everything, emails, access logs, proof that your firm fabricated those numbers. I didn't have the power to stop you then, but maybe I do now. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that draws breath from the air. Ethan stared at her, the truth forming like frost behind his eyes. You have evidence? I do, she said, enough to destroy Harrington Capital and anyone tied to its fraud. James's face paled, and for a moment his polished facade cracked, revealing the fear beneath. You'd ruin us both, he hissed. You think you can play hero? You'll bring down everyone, including him, he pointed at Ethan. You forget how close our companies are, Grace. Mitchell Innovations isn't clean either. Every partnership we've built together will fall if this gets out. Grace's expression didn't waver. Then maybe it should. Maybe it's time someone paid for what's been done in the shadows. Ethan's jaw tightened. His silence was no longer indecision. It was judgment forming. James, he said, his tone low and final. Get out. James blinked, disbelieving. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Ethan said. Get out before I forget how much we've built together. For a long moment, the two men stood eye to eye. Then James grabbed his coat, his voice cold with warning. You'll regret this, Ethan. Both of you will. When the door finally shut behind him, the wind howled again, sweeping snow into the silence he left behind. Grace stood motionless, her heart pounding. Ethan turned toward her, the firelight catching the edge of his face. "You just risked everything," he said quietly. Grace met his gaze, unflinching. "So did you." Outside, the storm began to die, but inside, another one had only just begun. The wind had calmed by morning, leaving behind a world washed clean. Pale light filtered through the diner's frosted windows, illuminating a place that had witnessed more truth in one night than most boardrooms did in a lifetime. Grace sat at a booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring into the quiet. The confrontation still echoed in her mind. James's threats, Ethan's decision, the strange relief that followed chaos. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerless. She felt seen. Ethan stood near the window, his reflection cast against the snow outside. The usually unshakable man looked worn but resolute. The silence between them was not discomfort. It was heavy with everything unspoken. Finally, he turned. "You said you have evidence," he said quietly. "Proof of what Harrington did." Grace nodded. "I do. It's safe, locked away. I thought I'd never need it again." "Then let's use it," he said. "Not to destroy, but to make things right." She searched his face for any trace of doubt, but there was none. The ruthless CEO she'd imagined had been replaced by someone stripped of pride, someone searching for redemption. "If you do this," she warned softly, "you'll lose everything. The partners, the investors, maybe even the company." Ethan's voice steadied. "Then I'll rebuild." But this time, on truth, something inside Grace cracked. The wall she'd built to survive. She hadn't realized how deeply she'd stopped believing that people could change, that power could be used for good. "You're serious," she murmured almost to herself. "I am," he replied. "You gave my mother shelter when no one else would. You gave me perspective when I didn't deserve it. Now I want to give you justice." Tears welled in her eyes, the kind that came not from sadness, but release. For the first time since leaving New York, she wasn't running anymore. She met his gaze and nodded. "Then we do it together." And they did. Within weeks, Grace handed over the evidence. Ethan assembled a legal team and turned it all over to the authorities. The revelations that followed tore through the industry. Harrington Capital collapsed, its executives indicted. Mitchell Innovations took a blow, but its integrity soared. In the eyes of the world, Ethan Mitchell had fallen and risen again. But in the eyes of Grace Porter, he had simply become what she'd always believed the world still needed. Proof that truth, even buried beneath snow and silence, always finds its way back to the light. 6 months later, Maplewood was bathed once more in winter light, but the storm that had once trapped 3 lives in its grip was now only a memory. The diner had been restored, new booths, polished counters, and a small brass plaque near the door that read, "The night kindness changed everything." Grace stood behind the counter, arranging flowers in a vase, her movements calm, assured. She owned the place now. What had once been a refuge for strangers had become a symbol of resilience and second chances. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Ethan stepped in, his familiar presence filling the room. He looked different, still powerful, but lighter, more human. The weight that once sat behind his eyes was gone, replaced by something warm. He carried 2 cups of coffee and set one before her. "For the woman who taught me that integrity doesn't melt in the storm," he said with a quiet smile. Grace laughed, shaking her head. "And for the man who finally learned that power means nothing without compassion." He leaned closer, his voice soft. "I meant what I said that night. I want to build something real, with you." Her heart fluttered, but her answer was simple. "You already have." Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, settling on the diner's window like tiny miracles. Inside, warmth and laughter filled the space. Grace glanced toward the stormy horizon and smiled. Because this time, the snow no longer meant fear. It meant peace, renewal, and love rediscovered.